The brass wheel gauge in Reba Kern's belt on the morning she walked out of Newcastle, Texas, had been her father's for 39 years, and the paper it clipped to her waist was an abandoned property notice she had filed the day before at the Young County Recorder's for a 2-mile stretch of the Brazos. Wash the Army had walked off the maps 70 winters back. Reba was 24. She had lost her father to a wet November 2 months earlier, and the wheelwright's shop and the deeded 80 acres to her stepmother's brother the following week. She was walking north to look for a powder wagon that had gone into the wash in 1852 on a run from San Antonio to Fort Belknap and had never come up. Newcastle said 70 winters was too many for a wagon full of powder to still be a wagon at all. Reba's father had said different. She meant to see who was right. If a story about a woman who took her father's word into a country that had forgotten him has ever felt close to yours, take a second to hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It helps the channel find the folks who need this kind of story most. Her name was Reba Josephine Kern. She was born in the wet fall of 1897 in a plank house on the west edge of Newcastle, in Young County, West Texas, in a corner of the Brazos country the Comanche had ridden through in living memory, and the Army had left in the 1880s, and the county had settled slow. Her father was Halbert Kern, a wheelwright and wagon maker, who had come out to Young County as a boy of 10 in the 1870s with an uncle from Fredericksburg, and had learned the trade under a man named Adolphus Rain, who had done contract work for the Army at Fort Belknap and Fort Griffin in the 50s and 60s. Her mother was Josephine Winters Kern, of Fredericksburg herself, whose father's people had come out of Prussia in the 40s. Her mother died in the childbed influenza of 1911 when Reba was 14, along with a small brother who did not live long enough to be named. Reba was, after that, her father's shop girl. Halbert Kern did not remarry. He took Reba into the wheelwright's shop from the time she was small and put a small brass and boxwood wheel gauge in her hand, a compass-like tool for measuring wagon wheel rim wear and hub camber, and taught her to read a wagon by its wheel the same way. Her Prussian grandfather had taught him to read weather by his knees. She learned the wagon trade. She learned, over years, what a Texas wheelwright's daughter could learn if the father was patient. How to spoke a wheel with the fellies still cold, how to bind a rim on iron in the shrinking cool of an evening, how to read a hub for the small hairline that meant the axle hole was going. She learned, above all, the arroyo trade. Halbert had done, as a boy under Adolphus Rhine, work on the Army's post-flood wagon recoveries. Walking out into the Brazos, wash after a storm to find the wagons the storm had taken. Some intact under mud, some scattered a mile, some at the bottom of a cut bank you would not find in 20 years of casual looking. It was a trade nobody had a name for except arroyo work. Halbert had it. He taught it to Reba. He taught her, when she was 12, on a hot, dry afternoon in the wash below Newcastle, how a flash flood in a West Texas arroyo does not scatter its heavy things at random. He taught her that a wagon caught in a flood does not roll far, because a loaded wagon in 5 feet of racing water goes on its side within 20 yards and stops within 100, and after that the flood buries what stopped. He taught her that the burial is not level. A wash lays sediment in graded curves against the cut banks, and the cut bank at the outside of a bend catches the heavy things and holds them under 6 or 8 feet of silt for as long as the wash keeps to that bend. He said, more than once, in the shop over a wheel, on the block Cochinney, a dry wash keeps every wagon it ever took. Learn to lift the covers. Cochinney meant beloved, and the old Polish of Mrs. Wiczorek down the road, who had come out to Young County in the 80s with a Silesian husband and had learned to make her bread in a Texas oven. and who had used the word for Reba from the day Reba was small enough for a Polish widow to pick up. Halbert Kern died of pneumonia in the wet November of 1921 at 59. He had been sick 2 weeks. He was buried in the Newcastle Town Cemetery, in a plot beside Josephine, on a cold, clear morning of light frost. Reba was 24. She kept the small brass and boxwood wheel gauge in her belt from that day on. Her father had remarried in 1918. A widow named Alma Yancey, from Graham, whom Halbert had met at a wagon auction and married in a small, brief ceremony 3 months later. Alma had been polite for a year and cold for 2, and she had brought with her, from Graham, a brother named Barlow Yancey. Barlow Yancey was a cattleman with pale eyes and a way of standing in a doorway with his hands in his coat pockets that Reba had disliked on sight. Barlow had been coming down to Newcastle every second Sunday since the marriage, ostensibly for supper. He had, over the 3 years, made himself as much at home in the shop as Halbert had permitted, which was not much. 2 weeks after Halbert's funeral, Alma called Reba to the kitchen and set a paper on the table. The paper was a bill of sale, dated the last week of Halbert's life, in which Halbert had transferred the wheelwright's shop and the deeded 80 acres to Alma for the sum of $1 and the assumption of certain debts. Alma had already, the paper stated, signed the property over to Barlow in exchange for the settlement of those debts. The signature at the bottom was Halbert's. It was Halbert's. Alma had not forged it, but the date was a lie. On the date shown, Halbert had been in the 2nd week of the pneumonia and had been unable to hold a spoon steady, much less a pen. Reba had been the one holding his water glass. She knew. She did not say so at the kitchen table. She said, quietly, that she would look at the paper in the morning. She went out to the shop. She took the brass wheel gauge and put it in her belt. She took the small Calumet baking powder tin she had kept since she was 15 on the top shelf of the shop, a red tin with the Indian chief's profile on the side, in which she had put every quarter she had ever earned trimming wagon rims on Halbert's overflow orders. There was $63 in it. She took her father's leather ledger, which Barlow had not thought to look at. She took her mother's small silver cross. She took the mongrel dog Cinch, who was 9 and had slept in the shop under Halbert's bench every night of his life. She was gone by the morning of the 2nd day. She did not slam the door. She closed it behind her the way a wheelwright's daughter closes a door, softly, on well-oiled hinges. She walked into Newcastle 4 blocks over and took a room at Mrs. Wicherek's for $2 a week, paid in laundry and cooking work. Mrs. Wicherek opened the door and looked at her once and said, "Co Cheney, come in." The dog, too. Reba stayed 3 nights without unpacking. On the 4th morning, she opened her father's ledger and started reading. She was looking for something specific. Halbert had told her, on the last afternoon of his life when he could still speak, a thing she had not been ready to hear then and had put away since. He had said, "Cocheny, the Rankin wagon, in the wash. You go up." I did not have time. She had asked what he meant. He had closed his eyes. He had said, "You go up." He had not spoken again that afternoon. He had died in the night. The Rankin wagon, she now believed, was in the ledger. It was. In the 7th book from the top, in an entry dated the summer of 1901, her father had recorded a private trip he had walked up the Brazos, wash north of Newcastle, in the company of Adolphus Rhine, then 80 years old. They had been looking for a powder wagon that had gone into the wash in a flash flood in the summer of 1852 on a run from San Antonio to Fort Belknap under a wagon boss named Wilbur Rankin with 3 teamsters and a small army escort. The wagon had been carrying 12 kegs of powder and a strong box of army pay for the Belknap garrison, and the flood had taken it above the confluence with Salt Creek. The Army had walked the wash 3 times in 1852 and had come out with nothing, and had, in the war years, forgotten the wagon entirely. Halbert and Adolphus, in the summer of 1901, had walked the wash for 11 days. They had found, at the outside of a bend called Willow Curve, a cut bank that Adolphus had recognized at once from the 50s, and Halbert had read the cut bank sediment and had said, on the 10th day, that the wagon was under it, about 8 feet below the current bank top, in a lens of graded silt that had not been disturbed since the flood. They had not dug it out. They had needed a team of men and a Fresno scraper. Adolphus had said, at the end of the walk, that the wagon could wait, and Halbert had marked the spot on a hand sketch and had come home and had not gone back. In the margin of the entry, in his neat wheelwright's hand, he had written, Willow Curve, outside bend, 6 paces down from the cottonwood that leans. Cochinney, if you ever have need of the wagon, take a team and the small folding spade and go slow. Rankin was carrying more than powder. There is a strong box under the driver's seat that was for his own hand, not the Army's. Do not disturb the powder kegs. They will be soft, but they will still be powder. She read the entry 3 times. She read it a 4th. She closed the ledger. Cinch thumped his tail on Mrs. Wycherek's floor. She said aloud, all right, Papa. Willow Curve? She spent the winter learning what she needed. She went to see Owen Threadgill in the 2nd week of December. Owen was 71, retired, and lived alone in a small board and batten house on the north edge of Graham, with a hound named Sledge and a stove that ran cold. Owen had been an Army muleteer at Fort Belknap in the 60s and a private contract teamster for the Belknap garrison in the 70s, and he had known Adolphus Rhine and Halbert Kern both. Owen looked at Reba a long moment at his door and said, you are Halbert's girl. She nodded. He said, come in, bring the dog. The hound will not mind. She stayed with Owen every 2nd week that winter, for 3 days at a time. He taught her the finer grade of arroyo work, how to test a cut bank for its stability with a small copper rod, how to shore a face cut with brush and rope, how to read the moisture line of an old buried lens for the season the burial had happened, how to handle old black powder that had gone soft in silt without setting off what was still viable. He gave her, in early March, his own hand-drawn map of the Brazos, wash from the confluence up to Salt Creek, folded soft with use. He said, when he handed it to her, a dry wash keeps every wagon it ever took. Learn to lift the covers. Halbert taught me that in 1901. He told me it was Adolphus's line, and Adolphus told me it was his own uncle's line. And it goes back further than that. It is the trade line. It is the one that will keep you alive if you listen to it. She thanked him. He walked her out to the wagon. He said, Cochinney, that is what Mrs. Wycherik calls you, no? Halbert told me. He liked it. She almost broke on his porch. She did not. She said, it is what she calls me. She got in the wagon and drove back to Newcastle. 2 Newcastle skeptics she left behind were the county recorder, Grady Beam, who had told her over his counter when she had filed the abandoned property notice that she was throwing her father's memory away, chasing an Army story 60 years dead, and Alma Yancey herself, who had come out to Mrs. Wycherek's on a Sunday afternoon to tell Reba, in front of Mrs. Wycherek, that Halbert would have wanted Reba to marry a decent Newcastle boy and settle, not go up the wash after ghosts. Mrs. Wycherek had said nothing during the visit, and had, after Alma left, put her hand on Reba's shoulder for a long moment and had not spoken. Her real trouble was Barlow Yancey, who filed a claim on the 12th of April against the abandoned property notice, on the grounds that the 2-mile stretch of the Brazos, wash Reba, had noticed was on land included in a grazing lease he had held with the county since 1919. He had not held any such lease. Reba's young Newcastle lawyer, a small, careful man named Norwood Kell, walked the county records himself the following Tuesday and confirmed that the grazing lease was a Barlow-Yancey fabrication drawn on a paper he had submitted the week before. The lease was struck within a fortnight. The abandoned property notice held. Reba had 30 days. She rode out to Willow Curve on the 18th of April with Owen Threadgill, Norwood Kell, and a hired laborer named Ephraim Halstead. She took 2 mules, a Fresno scraper, 3 folding spades, a coil of hemp rope, a length of oiled canvas for shoring, and the small copper testing rod Owen had given her. Cinch rode on the wagon seat between her and Owen. They camped that night at the confluence of the Brazos and Salt Creek in a mesquite grove that had been there since the 70s. In the morning, they went up the wash on the mules with the spades and the rope, and Reba read the wash as she went. She read it the way her father had taught her. At the 10th bend, she stopped. The bend was wide and slow, with the cut bank on the west side and a cottonwood leaning out from the top of the bank, and 6 paces down from the tree, where the cut bank cut deepest, a shallow depression in the sediment that only an eye that had been trained on cut banks would catch. She stood at the top of the bank a long moment. She said aloud quietly, "Willow Curve." Owen came up beside her. He looked. He said, "That is the place." Norwood Kell, who had never done arroyo work in his life, looked at the depression and said, "I do not see anything." Owen said, "You will." They shored the cut bank first. Owen and Ephraim cut mesquite for the shoring, while Reba drove the shoring stakes and lashed the canvas. It took the whole of the first afternoon. On the second morning, they cut a face slot in the bank, 8 feet wide, working downward with the spades in even lifts. The sediment was tight-packed silt over sand over a thin gravel lens. Exactly the graded sequence Halbert had taught her to look for. Cinch watched from the top of the bank. Ephraim worked the wagon rope. Owen watched the shoring. They reached the wagon on the 3rd morning at pace 6 down. The first thing they saw was the top of a wheel. A wheel is unmistakable when a wheelwright's daughter is the one to see it. She saw the outline of a rim, half lost in silt but there, and she stopped Ephraim's spade with the back of her hand and knelt herself and worked the last 2 inches of silt off the top of the rim with her palm. It was iron. It was an Army-issue wagon rim of the 50s, 3 inches wide, with the pintle mark of a Fort Belknap wheelwright at the joint. She said, "Papa." Cinch came down the bank to her. They uncovered the wagon over the next 4 days. It was on its side, as her father had said a flooded wagon would be, resting against a low ledge of the underlying gravel with the bed of the wagon facing north and the driver's box facing up. The cover had rotted long ago. The kegs of powder were in the bed, 12 of them, half buried in silt, some intact, some staved. She did not touch the kegs. She worked the silt off them carefully, so as not to shift them, and marked each keg with a small ribbon of colored yarn, so the recovery crew that would follow her. A bonded powder-handling crew Owen had already retained from Fort Worth, would know which kegs were sound and which were soft. Owen, who had handled old powder in his Army years, made the calls on soundness. He said, at the end of the 2nd day, that 4 of the 12 kegs were still viable powder, and 8 had gone to a wet paste that would not fire and would not explode. He said the 4 viable kegs should be moved by the powder crew to the Army Disposal Magazine at Fort Sill for controlled burning. Reba nodded. She uncovered the driver's box on the 5th morning. The driver's box on an Army freight wagon of the 50s was a small oak locker built under the driver's seat, with a hinged top and a wrought iron hasp. It was the box a wagon boss kept his personal papers and his own hands cash in, separate from the Army strongbox, which rode chained to the bed. She uncovered the driver's box first because her father's ledger had said the driver's box was where Wilbur Rankin's own papers would be, and because she was, in the end, more curious about Wilbur Rankin than about the Army pay. The box was intact. The oak had gone dark with silt, but the wood was sound. The iron hasp was corroded, but not broken. The lock, a small brass padlock the color of dried blood, was still on. She wedged the brass wheel gauge against the shackle and struck the blunt end of the gauge with a river stone she had brought for the purpose. The shackle rang. It did not give. She struck it again, did not give. She struck it a third time, harder, and it broke, a clean break, and the two pieces of the lock fell against the wagon side with the small, dry sound corroded brass makes in sand. She lifted the lid. Inside the driver's box were three things: a small waxed canvas packet, folded flat, a leather-bound wagon log, in Wilbur Rankin's short, firm hand, with the last entry dated the 18th of July, 1852, the morning before the flood. And, tucked beneath the log, a small, hand-tinted daguerreotype of a middle-aged man in a plain coat, with a full beard and pale eyes and the direct look of a man who was used to being asked hard questions. The name written on the reverse of the daguerreotype, in the same hand as the log, was Cyrus Rankin. She sat back in the silt. She lifted the waxed canvas packet out. She untied the small leather cord. Inside were two things: a folded sheet of foolscap, headed Testament, Wilbur Rankin, Freight Wagon Boss, Contract with U.S. Army, July 1852, and a single sealed letter addressed to Cyrus Rankin at a boarding house in Bastrop, Texas. She opened the letter. Wilbur Rankin wrote to his father, in a hand that had gotten firmer as he wrote, that he was sorry. He said he had driven army wagons for 15 years across West Texas and the territories, and had, in those 15 years, been at the bedside of every dying man in every fort in his contract country, and had come to the deathbeds of teamsters and troopers and Indian scouts and old wagon masters, and had held every one of their hands. He had not held his own father's. He wrote that Cyrus Rankin had been sick at Bastrop for the whole of the previous winter, and had asked, in 3 letters, whether Wilbur could come home. He wrote that he had told Cyrus each time that the next run was the last, and that he would come home when he had finished the Belknap contract. He had thought each time that he meant it. He had known each time that he had not. He wrote that his father had died in the March, before the summer he was writing in, and that Wilbur had learned of it by dispatch at Fort Chadbourne in the 3rd week of the Powder Run, and had continued the run because the wagon could not, in the middle of a contract, be turned around. He wrote, and Reba would remember these lines the rest of her life, that a man who drives army wagons for 15 years and holds every dying stranger's hand and does not sit by his own father's deathbed is not, in the end, the man he had thought he was. He wrote that if the letter reached Bastrop, he would like it to be given to the Bastrop pastor, who had been Cyrus's friend and who was to know that Wilbur had understood, at the end of his own run, what Cyrus had understood at the end of his, that a hand a son does not hold is worse than a hand no son held at all. Because the son had a choice, he signed his name. Under his name, in a smaller hand, "Papa, forgive me. I meant to come home." Reba sat down in the silt at the bottom of the face cut with the letter in her lap. Cinch came under her elbow. Owen and Ephraim above her at the top of the bank did not speak. She stayed still a long time. She copied the letter into her father's ledger, in pencil, word for word. She refolded Wilbur Rankin's original in the waxed canvas. She whispered Cyrus Rankin's name aloud. She did not know then whether Cyrus had had a widow, or whether the Bastrop pastor was still living, or whether any descendant of the Rankin family had stayed in Bastrop at all. She would find out. If you are new to the channel and finding us tonight at a hard patch, know that we make one of these every Friday, and every subscription helps the next one find you. Thanks for being here. They uncovered the Army strongbox the following afternoon. It was chained to the wagon bed with an iron chain that had corroded to a paper-thin shell and broke under a light pull. She did not open it in the wash. She and Owen and Ephraim hauled it up the cutbank on a rope and set it in the wagon bed. Norwood Kell had gone back to Newcastle to bring out the bonded powder crew. The strongbox came home in the wagon between Reba and Owen, with Cinch on top of it. They opened it in Norwood Kell's office in Newcastle on the following Monday, in the presence of a witness from the county sheriff's office, because Army pay is Army property under old federal law, and a witness was required. Inside were 42 rolled paper packets of Army specie, unpaid to a garrison that had been mustered out in 1867, and a corresponding paymaster's book. The Army specie was, under a federal statute Norwood Kell had researched over the winter, salvage property of the finder in the amount of the standard salvage rate, 30%, with the balance returned to the U.S. Treasury. Reba's share came to something over $4,000 in 1850s Army specie, valued at $1922, a figure Norwood Kell insisted on rounding down in the paperwork because he did not trust round numbers. He said it looked cleaner if the sum came out in odd ones. She trusted him and let him round. Cyrus Rankin, they learned by inquiry to the Bastrop County clerk, had died in March 1852, as Wilbur's letter said. He had left, however, a widowed sister who had raised his 2 orphaned grandchildren after his death. The grandchildren had, over the following decades, married and scattered. One of them, a woman named Bethia Rankin Coulter, had lived out her life in Bastrop and had died in 1922, aged 84. She had, however, left a daughter, Rankin Coulter Ives, aged 61, who lived in Bastrop still and ran a small hardware store on the courthouse square with her husband. Reba took the train down to Bastrop in the second week of May, with Cinchich in a wicker basket at her feet and the letter and the daguerreotype in an oilskin packet in her coat. Rankin Ives received her at the back of the hardware store. She was a lean, quiet woman with pale eyes and the direct look of the man in the daguerreotype. Reba put the packet down between them. She said, "This was your great-uncle's. He wrote it to his father, your great-grandfather. It was in a driver's box under a wagon in the Brazos wash for 70 years. I think perhaps you should have it." Rankin Ives read the letter. She read it twice. She looked up. She said, "My grandmother said, until the day she died, that Uncle Wilbur was a good man who had run out of time." Reba said, "He wrote he had understood at the end that he had spent the time on the wrong hands." Rankin Ives took Reba's hand across the counter of her store and held it a long minute. They drank coffee. Reba went back to Newcastle by way of the Young County Recorder's office. She hired Norwood Kell to file a suit against Alma Yancey's bill of sale, on the strength of her father's dated ledger, which proved that Halbert Kern had not held a pen on the day the transfer had allegedly been signed. Norwood Kell, careful as he was, took 90 days. The court struck the transfer. The wheelwright's shop and the 80 acres came back to Reba as Halbert Kern's only heir. Alma Yancey left Newcastle within the month. Barlow Yancey left Young County within the year. He was heard of, later, running a small stockyard in Wichita Falls. Reba did not go looking. Vindication does not require a person to travel. She used the salvage money for 4 things. She bought back the wheelwright's shop clear of any lien. She commissioned a small marble stone for Wilbur Rankin at a plot she paid for at the Newcastle Cemetery so that a wagon boss, who had lain in the wash for 70 years, could have a stone with his name on it in country he had crossed. She paid Owen Threadgill a partner's share for the rest of his working life, which turned out to be 6 years. She put the balance in a savings bank at Graham and did not touch it except in November for the Newcastle Schools Coal Fund. Cinch is buried at the fence corner nearest the shop. where he liked to sit and watch the road. There is a smooth river stone over him, with his name scratched in with a nail. Mrs. Wieczorek died in 1928 at 79, and Reba held her hand at the end, and Mrs. Wieczorek called her Kochany one last time. Owen Threadgill died in 1928, the same year, in his own bed, with Sledge the Hound at his feet. Norwood Kell married a Fort Worth schoolteacher and became county attorney for Young County and remained Reba's lawyer and friend for the rest of her life. Reba did not marry. She was asked gently by a Graham cattleman and, less gently, by a Fort Worth freight agent, and she said, of both of them, that she was grateful and unavailable. She kept the small brass wheel gauge in her belt. She kept the Calumet baking powder tin on the mantel with a lock of Cinch's coat in it. She kept the copy she had made of Wilbur Rankin's letter in a drawer with her father's ledger. She ran the wheelwright's shop until 1948, and then, when trucks had put wagons in the museum, converted it to an auto body shop and hired a young man from Graham to run it for her and stayed on as owner until her death. Some things a person learns only from a wash. Reba learned, over the years, that Wilbur Rankin had held every stranger's hand in every fort in West Texas for 15 years, and had not held his own father's, and had died in the flood, knowing exactly what he had not done. That her own father, Halbert, had walked to Willow Curve in 1901 and had left the wagon there for her because he knew what she would do with it. And that a wheel gauge and a spade and a ledger were, in the right hands, the tools of a trade that had a name only in the mouths of the 2 or 3 men in each generation who kept it alive. The Army specie in the strongbox had bought back a shop and paid a partner and set a marble stone at Newcastle. The letter had done more, because the letter had put a Rankin who had waited 70 years for a word, finally in possession of the word. Newcastle had said, the April Reba Kern walked out with a folding spade and a hired laborer, that 70 winters was too many for a powder wagon to still be a powder wagon. The wash had another opinion. So, in the end, did the driver's box. If you have ever missed a hand that was reaching for yours because you thought there would be a next run, drop a comment below and tell us who was on the other end of it. I read them all. See you in the next one.